Hey guys, open up chat again so I can see it. Okay. How are you guys doing? Okay. Chugging along. Is that clear enough with the green? It's pretty dark on my end, but you let me know. Yep, that sounds about right. Hanging in there. We'll get through it. We'd be right now, right? It's have to be 70, and then 2 days later it's snowing, and then there's tornadoes. Just bonkersness. Well, look, you had 11 people jump in like real quick. You guys are snowing by you too. Oh, gross. It's too much. That's all too much. No, I'm gonna give it like one more minute just to let any stragglers come in, and then we can start up. Let's see, hold on. Right. Yeah, no, 2020 has been a trip. Let's just say that. A lot. But we're getting through it. We're almost a quarter. We're a quarter of the way through, sort of. That's something. Did you guys appreciate, or if you haven't done the reading yet, my cat would not get off of my book because I can't go to any of the normal places that have scanners. I had to do it at home, and she is very curious. So you'll get to see a little bit of my cat when you do the readings for this week. Just, sorry. Okie dokie. All right, we got 14. We did another minute. I think that should be good. All right. Okay, so this week we are doing military personnel and basing strategy. It's a little, it's not as like hardcore like as what you would commonly view as like a national security issue, but these are technically U.S. territory. They're like part of the United States. They're U.S. citizens. So even though a lot of the military personnel or the basing strategies that we talk about aren't, like directly responding to a threat, it is involving U.S. citizens, and it's, like trying to prevent future things, or at least where we determine where they're placed is really important for our, how effective those issues that we've talked about earlier are, right? As long as we can have some of these bases, then Camp Adventure. 1 second. But as long as, like this is still something we need to consider when we're looking at how effectively we can provide our national security. Sadie is asking me if I've ever heard of Camp Adventure. I have not, but I did go to Operation Purple Camp a few times. I'm not sure if that's the same thing. That was for military brats who had deployed family members. I'm not sure if it's similar. Before I go into any substantive stuff, I did want to just kind of get some admin things out of the way. Quiz 2's graded, so I went through and did all of the short answer things. Oh, cool! You did an internship. I didn't really do that because the only time we lived overseas was actually my last year of high school, so I didn't really have a lot of time to integrate myself into that military base. Why you got that grade, but if you don't have any comments, it's because you got full credit. So, what does there say? Make sure you do the writing assignment and the discussion board. If you are not posting in this live chat right now, you'll need to do the discussion board to get your participation points for the week. And then there's also a new writing activity that I've added in. So I talk about it in these live streams, and I have it listed as an assignment on Icon. I'm not sure if it's specifically listed like on this week's section for the syllabus, but it is a module on your Icon page. So use that to know where it is. There's a description of that assignment in there. It's really just kind of giving me a bit, and then what are the key points you're trying to make throughout your paper. Haley is asking if there's a discussion board. If you are already participating in the live stream chat, Amina is asking, I think it's called the final paper activity. It might have the word writing on the front of it. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. But not super difficult, really just, can you tell me what your thesis is and what are the key points in your paper? So it can be informal, kind of like the reflection, Sydney. It doesn't need to be really long. I'm not expecting like, you know, your whole paper to be turned in. I just want to see that you're thinking about your argument a bit. Kat is asking about the formatting. So yeah, it does not need to be formal. You can be informal with me and just do like bullet points for each if you want, or you can write it out if that helps you. It's up to you. Yes, Arissa, if you are participating in the live stream, you do not need to post in the discussion board. Yeah, I'm just giving options, you know, asynchronous or synchronous participation. You have the choice. You don't have to do both. Yeah, I'll give you feedback if I think you're moving in the wrong direction. That's usually no national security, or if I'm unsure how your points work together, then I'll give you feedback on that. Yeah, thank you, Brooke. That's a good question. Kind of building on this, I know it's been confusing with the participation, but I've been getting a lot of questions that have been addressed either in these live streams or in the emails that I've been sending you guys. So just, I want to remind you that that's pretty much the way I contact you most of the time, is on the icon email, which I think should come through your campus email. So just either make sure that you've got that set up right so that you see those emails and they don't go to your spam, and just check your emails, because I usually tell you, you know, like what we should be doing in the week, or at least, you know, reminding you of what's going on. So that's all you need to study. It's not cumulative at all. Annika is asking about sources for the writing assignment. No, I don't need to see your sources right now. I really just want to know that you're thinking about your argument, and just like what is the core components of that. So like I said, it's not like a full draft. That's not due yet. All I want right now is kind of like a very truncated outline. What is your argument that you're making in the paper? But yeah, you don't need sources just yet. I would try and get them in for your draft. If you are worried that you're not formatting them correctly, that would be a chance to get it evaluated, but right now, not necessary. Okay, any other admin questions? Substantive slide. Okay, so I gave you a pretty diverse set of readings. Some were like, RAND is a corporation that does a lot of studies for the military. I had a news article, and I had a chapter from an academic book. So lots of different things. Essentially, what we need to do is to understand military basing and like how the military itself works as an entity. We need to look at these 5 things. So we need to understand active duty personnel. We need to understand the different types of military bases, and then we can explore what happens with forces stationed abroad, military families, and then the forces stationed at home, right? So there's a couple different things we need to break down. And then at military personnel or active duty, those are the people that are currently in the military, right? There's a couple terms that I really just want us to understand, and then we can move on from there. Military forces. So if I'm saying that forces stationed abroad are doing this, or like what are the military forces? That's a very aggregate term. It means more than just the actual members of the military. It also includes weapon systems, equipment, necessary support, or any combination of those. And when I say necessary support, in some cases that can be really extensive. It can be, you know, having restaurants and hospitals and hotels. It could mean bringing the families of those military personnel with them and building housing for them and having the infrastructure to support those families. So when we look at forces, it can be really big, or it can just be, you know, the soldiers and the weapons that they have. So just recognize that forces is a pretty broad term. That means more than just like the actual active duty military personnel. But when I refer to military personnel, those are the individuals that are required either in a civilian or military capacity to accomplish a mission. So when we're looking at that, it says civilian or military because you can have contractors, you can have outside people that they bring in to try and help on that mission, but they all act as military personnel. And then third is the military base itself, airfield or an aircraft carrier. So all three of those definitions essentially say where the military personnel coming from, but there's variation in how big that is. It can either be a base that has all the logistical support needed for those military personnel. It can be as much as just like a few buildings. It could be an entire locality, right? Like kind of a tiny town maybe, or and even how permanent something like a military base is. And I will show you some pictures in a second to kind of talk about that. But I wanted to get one last term in before I lose my beautiful terms slide. So the last one that you need to know for this is deployment. And deployment is the movement of forces into and out of an operational area. So it's sending forces from one area to another area, essentially. Usually, when people talk about deployment in the military, it means going from your home to some other place where you're not formally stationed. So you have the place where the military personnel, actively live in, they generally reside in, and they're being sent somewhere that they don't normally work at, and that's what a deployment is. Nate is asking, would Allied forces count in personnel or forces? I would say if they're actual, let's see, if they're acting as military, like actual military members, I would say they probably count as military personnel because they are those individuals that are required to accomplish the mission. But if they're only acting as kind of supportive figures, like just providing logistics or, like help members of the military that are working on the assigned mission, and forces kind of broadens the term to say, okay, so like beyond the people who are actually working on the mission, who provides the logistical support, what provides that support, all of those fall under the term forces. So let's see, David is asking about contractors. I think, again, there's a lot of variation in contractors. If they're actually acting in a capacity where they're directly helping accomplish the mission, then they would be military personnel. And if they're not, then they easily fall under the definition of military forces. Doctor, any of the contractors vary in what they do. But yes, definitely. Good. I'm glad that we're getting specifics on this because it is, a nebulous, it's a lot of the same word being used in different ways, so I can understand that we need to clarify it. Okay, so those are our key terms. So I mentioned that military bases can vary, right? There's changes in how expansive they can be. So here's 4 examples of different types of military bases. This one in the bottom left for you guys is a forward operating base in Afghanistan. So this has military personnel in it, but it doesn't really have a lot of that extra logistical support, right? It's literally just the tents and some trucks, and there's some storage containers out back. There is not a restaurant, they don't have houses, there are not really any formal roads here, right? There's not a lot of extra things being brought in. It's just who are the exact military personnel we need, and that's it. It's pretty bare bones. Compare that to, let's look at this one. So this right here is Ramstein Air Base at the bottom right. What was the name? This is a forward operating base. So it's kind of like a scout, like they get sent ahead to try and establish the initial presence. And then if we wanted to build a more formal, permanent presence, we would do something like this bottom right example, which is Ramstein Air Base in Germany. So this is a full airport that we've built. You have buildings and roads built into this. There's a school on the base. There's a hospital, everything that you would need to really support all of the individuals that would be present on this base is there, and that base has been there for 50 years, basic military personnel. In this top right example, this is, I'm not sure which specific one it is, but this is an aircraft carrier. So this isn't even, a permanent land. There's not a specific location it's attributed to. It, does its route. It's mobile, but it still counts as a type of military base because it's the point at which the personnel that are stationed on it move out, into the kind of theater of combat that they're that they may potentially enter into. And then the final example I have is this one in the top left. This is Wright-Patterson. These kinds of really big, institutionalized, full logistical support bases, even within the United States. It doesn't have to be just in places where where there isn't an access to U.S. hospital. This is a picture of the hospital in Wright-Pat, and they don't have their own school, but they do have housing, they have parks, they have a grocery store, there's a theater in there and a bowling alley. So you can have just as much, kind of that logistical nebulous support within the United States as you would have outside of the United States. Okay. So let's look at those forces stationed abroad, U.S. military forces. Amna is asking, what were the names of each base? If you go top left is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Top right, I don't have a name, but that's an aircraft carrier. Bottom right is Ramstein Air Base. This is actually a shared NATO base too. It's more than just the United States. And then bottom left, that is a forward operating base. It's in Afghanistan, if that helps. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name because I'm pretty sure I would butcher it, but that is in Afghanistan. Okay, so forces stationed abroad, yeah. Each of these countries in pink host military forces. So this is all of the places where the United States has a presence. The one in the bottom right is in Germany. The one in the top left is in the United States. So it's kind of showing that even within United States territory, you can still have really big, very permanent bases. There's just, it's really just designed to fit the situation they're in. But you can see that both of them are still accomplishing what they need to do to finish the mission, even if they already exist within the United States. Yeah, just thought they were good comparisons, because even within the US, we have really massive bases that get built up a lot. Okay, so all of these different countries, you've got big ones, you've got little ones, you've got developed ones, you've got less developed ones. There's a lot of variation. Why do countries host military forces, and why do we send those forces abroad, right? So there's three main things we can get out of this: that host countries are trying to use those bases to achieve their own domestic goals, right? And then and then those domestic players within the host country want to use the bases as well, right? To get that kind of external support from the United States. So they can be used to acquire economic assistance from the United States, and then the host country takes that money and distributes it to their domestic supporters, right? So money and influence brought into the country. But you can also see that a lot of host countries are using that kind of external recognition from the United States to actually give themselves a sense of legitimacy, right? Because it's a pretty strong signal for the US to say, we recognize that you are strong enough, we're going to have this kind of a discussion with you, a conversation to create this military base. Let's work together, right? And that's a really strong signal that the United States can send to the world that they want to work with this host country. So the host country has a lot that they can gain from it, and then the United States gets to build the military base there that they want to build to achieve their own military goals. So let's actually look at how some of that plays out in real life. So these three graphs show how much the host country spends versus how much the United States spends on some of their military bases abroad. So if you look at Germany on the left-hand side, the United States pays about 82% of the money required to upkeep the base, and then Germany pays about 18%. In Japan, it's 50-50, and then in South Korea, the United States pays about 60% of it, and then South Korea pays about 40% of it. Right, so there's a lot of variation. It kind of depends on the relationship between the countries, how they've negotiated it. Bryant is asking, do you know what year these graphs are from? This one, I don't think it's super recent. But it's from Stars and Stripes, so it's like from the military newspaper, essentially. But I think it's probably 2010 or around that time period. Yes, because we did talk about Korean class, yeah. So what we see is, oh, actually, yeah, no, it's probably old and change how these are divided up, especially in Germany. That's the one that President Trump brings up a lot, saying that, the NATO members aren't paying their fair share. The only problem is that this division was negotiated within the SOFA that was created between those two countries. So trying, essentially, if the US says that they want Germany to pay more, they're actually like backing out of the contract that they signed with them. So there's a lot of pushback domestically on the German front about changing the amount of money that they would be paying. Amna is asking to clarify, there's a difference between US occupying forces and US military basing. Yes, actually, I talk about that in a later slide. This is what I'm talking about, US military forces. That's what all most US military bases are. We usually don't build a base somewhere unless there's enough stability to really support it. I think one of the only ones where we don't have that kind of agreement right now is Iraq. We used to have that agreement, it expired, and then we continued to stay there because of a lot of the instability that was happening in that region. So that's more of a signal that they don't have the legitimacy, right? They're not going to get that strong sense of, signal of support from the US because the United States doesn't feel like that country is stable enough to require that kind of signaling. So once that area stabilizes a bit more, if the United States does want to remain in that country, you'll see, one of those basing contracts drawn up between the two of them. It literally might be like one of the next couple of slides. Okay, so let's talk more about that concept of legitimacy then. Essentially, when they create this kind of peaceful basing, or at least the agreement for it, the United States is showing that it is willing to formally negotiate a basing agreement with a country and provide that kind of external recognition. So these can be folded into defense pacts, and that has an agreement about if military forces were to be peacefully hosted, how would it work, right? So they can be enveloped in that. Another way you can see these agreements signed is through status of forces agreements, which is what my dissertation is about. They're specifically on just having a foreign presence of forces in another country. And there's a lot of variation in how they're structured. So Katie is asking, how hard is it to renegotiate these types of things? It's not actually very hard for the status of forces or the SOFA. Their Creation Pact, it might be a little bit harder if you have a lot more players that you're adding into the game. But it really is, it's as difficult as both states want to make it to be. That's the easiest way, I'll say, I guess, because if the United States doesn't want to renegotiate it, they can make it really difficult, right? If they don't want to actually change anything. But then it doesn't have to be difficult. So these kinds of agreements provide formal documentation showing that the host state is strong enough to negotiate and to institutionalize the agreement, right, and to actually hold up their end of the deal, right? That's a really strong signal. And then, yes, so there is a difference between, this is your question, between occupying and peacefully hosting, right? So this is a paper that I worked on this past year, using these kinds of basing agreements to actually identify when occupations end. So historically, if you look at, well, here, I'll just explain this whole chart. So each of these is a case of military occupation, right? Historical military occupations. So East Austria was occupied by the Soviet Union, West Austria by the United States, right? When the occupation started, and then using our very vague definition of occupation, we've had this idea that once the conflict ends, then the occupation ends because there isn't a conflict anymore, right? So these all kind of line up for when the conflicts actually ended. But what we're seeing now, more often at least, and you see it in Iraq, I think most clearly, countries aren't leaving when the conflict ends, right? We, as part of the war on terror kind of idea for this conflict, the United States said that they wanted to change the ideology, the concept, like the actual culture of that country, right? To make sure that terrorism wouldn't happen there again. So after the conflict ended, the United States actually stayed to try and create that cultural shift. But at what point does it stop being an occupation? Because from our traditional definition, it should have ended once the conflict ended, right? If we use those kinds of basing agreements, those formal contracts, we can actually get a clearer understanding of when it switched from an occupation to a peaceful hosting of troops, right? Because that's when the country received that external recognition and legitimacy from the US that said, you are your own country now. We're going to negotiate with you. Can we be here? They actually, asked for permission and consent to have their forces there versus forcefully putting people in a country that couldn't say no, right? Yes, so Amana is asking, totally, the thing is a lot of Iraqi civilians are extremely skeptical of the US presence. Yeah, and I think right now that's pretty fair because technically it's probably closer to an occupation. There isn't that kind of formal basing agreement right now to say that the US has permission to be there, right? So this is a little bit of my research, just gives you. Amna is saying it doesn't seem like there's some sort of legitimate peace building presence according to civilians. Yeah. The question of legitimacy really kind of comes up in Iraq now because there isn't that formal on how legitimate or how peaceful, the presence, the US military presence is in that country right now. All right. And then you have these slides, so feel free to explore if you want that chart and all the other data that I put up today. I have a lot of graphs today because there's cool trends we can see. Okay, so if we have military agreements that can help make it, legitimate to have military forces abroad peacefully that shows that kind of external recognition, what can make that peaceful presence of troops difficult, right? What are some of the issues that we see when the US is putting their forces abroad peacefully? They're doing it for a reason, right? They want to achieve their goals for whatever reason, they need to have the military presence abroad. But what happens as the United States stays there? When regime change happens, when, there's a revolution in the country, when a country becomes a democracy or when it becomes an autocracy, that can make these basing contracts really difficult. There's a debate within the host country at that point that says, the old administration negotiated this. That's not how we do things anymore. And they might not hold that basing contract to be true anymore. So there's a lot of uncertainty that happens when you have regime change. Internal institutional competition can make them difficult. If you don't have a cohesive government, if you don't have, every part of that host country kind of agreeing and working the same way, that can make it really difficult for a host country to follow or at least respect the basing agreement. And then a fragmented party system can create a lot of anti-base sentiment as well, right? So when there's not a lot of cohesion in the political ideas of the citizens in a country, that can be difficult. When there's a lot of disagreements in how to run the country, that can also lead to a lot of anti-base kind of ideas. This picture right here is in Okinawa. It's one of the many anti-military base protests that have occurred in there over the years. The Okinawa base is a pretty contentious one. There's been a lot of public discourse about, how permanent it should be, if it should still be in Japan, and kind of how the US military personnel are legally treated. So if they commit any crimes, kind of how that all plays out has also been the subject of a lot of protests. So if we've got all these issues coming up, is there anything that the United States can do that usually reduces how these are debated, right? So if you had something similar to the United States with like a two-party system, it's a lot easier to kind of understand how that party system is working, to get a clear message across, to have a more cohesive understanding of the military base and a way to present that base to the host country. Democratization usually helps out with this as well. So if a country becomes a democracy, it's a lot easier to ease the stress of that military base because you can, first of all, legitimize it pretty easily, right? You're not going to have a lot of those questions and uncertainty about how the base works or if it was, put in forcefully or how the administration feels about it, because you're going to have a democratic institution that's helping negotiate, have a lot more stability in a democratic country versus an authoritarian one. And then secondly, when you have more routine institutions, so when there isn't a lot of debates between the different parts of government, you can have a much clearer kind of discussion about the base as well. Hannah is asking, what about the conflict that often comes about during the transition to democracy? Do you mean like are they not peacefully hosted then, kind of? In all honesty, the forces themselves would probably be, taken out of the country if it becomes really unstable like that. They probably would still, they wouldn't really be occupying a country forcefully. They would just have the previous military agreement that they had negotiated. They would have that contract that says they could be there. And then probably they just wait until it all calmed down and then see what happens with the new administration, because they're not in a conflict with that country, right? So the United States isn't in conflict with that host country, regardless of if there is a conflict, going on internally. The United States still isn't fighting that country. So there's not really a point where I would say that they're occupying, unless after they have the regime change, and the new regime says they can't be there, and the United States decides to stay. Only I think at that point would you say that they're actually, forcefully putting an example of these kinds of discussions. This is Poland's president actually meeting with President Trump to talk about the base that we have in Poland, right? So he has the support of his voters who put him in office, and he ran on a specific platform, and he had ideas about what he wanted to do with the military base, right? So it's much easier for him to say, this is what my people want. My power comes from my people. This is what I need to have done about the military base. And then he can have a direct conversation with the United States, making, his claims and desires for the Polish military base. So it's a lot easier for this kind of conversation to happen, though, when you're working in a democratic system. Kat is asking, if forces leave bases that are more permanent, like there are restaurants, etc., what would happen to them if the U.S. forces were to leave? Would they just be abandoned or demolished? When you say forces, do you mean like people? I think I just need you to clarify your question a bit, because if the forces left and then they got orders to leave, they would have to leave. That's just how it would work. If you're saying maybe like if a kid wanted to stay in a country, but their family went back to the States because that's what their orders were, that child would have to figure out how to stay based on the legal, system of that host country. But the orders that let that family live in that foreign country were from the military. So they would have to kind of follow in those orders. The individuals would have to follow the orders they got from the military. So if the military tells them they have to leave, then they have to leave, because they're not citizens of, like Afghanistan. They can't stay in Afghanistan without a passport or a visa. So they would have to leave. For something more like the buildings that they built, or like any changes they made to that host country, that's determined on a case-by-case basis. Just whatever they added into the contract on that, it's up to them. Yeah, for the infrastructure. So Hannah's adding for the infrastructure. It depends. It really does depend. In Germany, the U.S. basing agreement says the United States doesn't have to return it to the state that they found it. In other countries, they do. So it's case by case. They can add those stipulations into the basing agreement and then just follow what they say. Yeah, so Sadie's saying that when she lived in Italy, the plan was for the infrastructure to stay, and then the Italian citizens would just have access to it afterwards. That's an option, yeah. It just depends on what those two countries have negotiated between the two of them. You can have it where they don't have to return it to the former presence, and you can have it not be that. There's a lot of debate. If you want to look at this from like a more environmentalist perspective, there's actually a lot of debates about these kinds of stipulations because, of like pollution or how the changes to the geography have, affected, river systems or the water table. So there's a lot of debates about that currently, but it's not as directly related to like, how is the security process working? But that's something to look into. I think it's interesting, and it is something that a lot of the citizens are talking about currently. Yeah, but yeah, it just depends. It all is based on the contracts that they signed. Okay, so like a lot of what we talk about today is broader than just, the pure like, how do military bases help us achieve our military missions, because there's a lot more happening when we're talking about military bases than just that. So there's also sociological effects of this basing practice that I want us to discuss. So Savannah is asking, sort of off topic, but since we have bases all over the world, if one of our allies wanted to build a base in the US, would our government allow it? Technically, there's nothing saying that they can't, but historically, the United States has never allowed a foreign country to build a military base on our continental territory. Is the fully worded answer to that question. Canadian section to it, there's a United Kingdom section to it, there's an Italian section to it, right? So there's a lot of different countries represented in what you could maybe call, US territory. So technically, we do have allies stationed on US territory, but within the actual continental US, historically, no, it has not happened. I don't think there's anything saying they couldn't. I think it's unlikely that it would get approved if someone asked to do that, right? I think that's a really, it's a signal that I don't think the United States wants to send, that they would allow someone to, have control over their territory. So I can understand why it hasn't happened yet, but technically there's nothing saying it can't. Yeah, good question though, yeah. Okay, so sociological repercussions. So I showed you the picture of the Okinawa protest a couple slides ago. That one happened due to a jurisdictional issue where they were debating if a rape case for a US soldier had been properly kind of concluded and if the end result was fair. Arissa is asking, or how do judicial processes work for military personnel who commit crimes? That is my dissertation. So I actually am looking at that, trying to understand it from a large end perspective. There's different ways that it can be done, but usually there's like three broad categories of how jurisdiction can be split up. You can either have the sending state retain full control of the forces they send abroad. You can have the receiving state, the actual host country, have more jurisdictional power. There's really only like one case where they had full control over those visiting forces. But usually you see something called like split control or concurrent control, which is where the two states kind of divide it up, and they divide it based on if the crime was committed or involved or was located in either the sending or the receiving state. Action between sending and receiving state citizens or property or territory, then those two countries work together and they have to share information, they have to, share evidence, they have to investigate together, and then that individual, whoever is brought up for that crime, can be tried then, and then the sentence carried out. But yeah, it's something I'm interested in, I guess is how I would word it. It's definitely interesting to see how those play out, and a lot of the outcomes of those kinds of cases produce a lot of protests. in those kind of host states, those states receiving those visiting forces. Yeah, okay. Just wanted to make sure I didn't miss a question. So there are other, besides actually that jurisdictional kind of issue, there's a lot of other things that have kind of promoted discourse from the receiving state or protests. Unpopular missions has been one of them. So like the war in Iraq is pretty contentious among people. This protest on the top is actually, again, in Germany, it's specifically against the use of drones. So it's citizens in the receiving state being upset that drones that are involved in a conflict they don't support are being, are taking off from a base in their country. So they're upset that their country is being used to launch these kinds of tools. And then just general anti-American attitudes can also happen, right? So they don't like the presence of the US military forces in their country. They don't like the base. They don't like where it is or how big it is. There's just general anti-American sentiment that can actually be created from these bases as well. So those are not necessarily national security issues, but they're sociological things that can stem from these kinds of this kind of military presence. So your article, one of the articles that I signed, or was this the book chapter? I think it's the book chapter. Has a lot of potential solutions that they propose to fixing these kinds of issues. Using IPE, like international political economy, foreign direct investment, receiving state, maybe that would help it out, right? Can they get some economic support? But at the end of the day, the US should make sure that they democratically validate their military bases, have that contract, get that permission. They should pay, at least in some part, for those military bases, right? So even that graph that we had a few slides ago, the lowest contribution the US has is the 50-50 split with Japan, but it's still paying for 50% of those bases. And then recognize that there are domestic changes within those host countries, right? That can be a really big issue within that country, right? Okay, so before I talk about this, why did we talk about all of these information we just presented? Because if there's unrest within that host country, then you're putting those visiting forces at risk, right? Massive protests, anti-American sentiment, all of that can be pretty dangerous to those US forces that are stationed abroad. So understanding why that kind of unrest happens and how we can prevent it can actually protect those US citizens that we are using to fight in our conflicts, right? So one of the responses that has happened, or at least one of the changes that the US military has been seeing recently, is an increased focus on this idea of lily pad basing. What it is it's a fundamental change in how the United States military forces are stationed abroad, and it hopes to reduce the cost of that kind of basing by essentially making it so that we don't have any of those really big, sprawling, expensive, massive military bases abroad. Instead, we would have a bunch of little ones, and you could just kind of essentially like a frog hop across those little bases to get to where you need to go without having to impose as strongly on those host countries. So you would reduce the cost by essentially just making it so the bases could only support those military personnel that we need without having to have, I'll leave it at that, yeah. The second component of these changes that we're seeing is that there's more global interaction or integration in our military conflicts, right? So where before, I think the example that's clearest is South Korea and North Korea. So the United States has a military presence in South Korea. If North Korea were to attack, that conflict before would have been limited to just the peninsula, right? But if you look at that conflict now, if you remember, yeah, we talked about this in class. If you remember the map of like how far missiles can reach now, right? The ballistic missiles that North Korea has can reach a lot farther than just the peninsula, right? So that conflict is a lot more globalized than it used to be, and the United States has to change its military strategy to recognize that. And then finally, the third kind of key point in our new strategy is to keep that strong focus on our allies, right? That's where the United States really has the biggest advantage. It's put the most work into it, right? We've had these allies, most of them, for 50 years. So you want to keep that relationship strong, and you want to make sure that they're going to continue to support the United States. So each of these are three major changes, but let's break it down a little bit more. I have more pictures for it. So when I talk about the lily pad basing, these are all of the military bases, mostly, that the United States has abroad, right? The bigger the circle, the more bases are actually within that single country, if that helps. The yellow ones are those kind of traditional, very big, kind of permanent bases, but the red ones, these little red circles, are lily pads. So they're very tiny. They're not going to, be super developed. They're not going to be imposing on the host country very much. And they're just quick little jaunts that the military can use to get to where they need to go. And then the blue dots are also lily pads, but they're unconfirmed. So there's not a lot of, we're not sure if they're being used that way or if they're there, but there's an idea that they exist. So we can use this and really see that there aren't that many of those traditional bases anymore. You're seeing a lot more of those lily pads, and you can see the lily pads in areas where maybe there's a bit more uncertainty about the host country, or there's maybe more domestic pressure against the US presence. David is asking, are they like black sites? I don't think they're like black sites. They're just a little bit more secretive about if they have something there than normal. When I say these lily pads are usually like an airport, an outpost. So it's maybe just that they don't want to confirm that they are using that as an airport or a jumping off point. But we're pretty sure they are. I don't think it's as secretive as they just don't want the world to know that they're doing anything there. I don't think it's that far. And none of these are CIA, if that helps either. Like black sites are generally CIA. This is all US military forces. So it's, Air Force, Army, Marines, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so there's a bit of a difference though in where they're located, how many there are, right? You can kind of see changing patterns in what the United States is from the traditional big bases that we had post-World War II to lily padding is the reduction in the size of bases abroad, right? Cody is saying, are these all the confirmed military bases that include just airstrips? It should be both. So lily pads are frequently just airports and airstrips. So all of those dots would be confirmed bases and airstrips. It's all those different types, right? Like the definition that we're using for bases can include both. So it's all of those included. So when we're looking at, slipping my finger. Okay. When we're looking at military bases abroad and we switch that kind of lily padding style, it means that you're going to be separating the military families from those members of the military that are actually in the service, right? Because those new bases are tiny, they don't have that infrastructure, they don't have housing, right? So you have to separate those two groups. And when we do that, there can be a lot of ramifications to the actual family of those military personnel. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to explore how that idea of deployment, of separation between the family member that's in the military and their family has worked over time, and kind of look at it from a more sociological perspective and understand how that separation works, what effects we see, how has it worked over time. Right is just what percent of the US population was in the military at any year, right? It goes all the way from 1900 to 2010. What we see is that there are a couple spikes, but really the world that we've grown up in is pretty low on military. Not a lot of people that are family members of someone in the military, right? So it's a very small segment of the population, and they have a very different lifestyle than someone who isn't in the military, right? Because there's no chance of deployment. There's no chance of, having the military order you somewhere. So you're going to see different things that make those families unique. looking at a bit more detailed data for recent events. This circular graph is looking at who gets deployed, so who gets that formal separation, even when we have those traditional bases, right? Because this lily padding idea is very new. Who gets deployed? So the different colors represent different branches of the armed forces. So that's like the Navy and the Air Force and, you know, the Army. So the colors represent those forces. And then as they move along, a month to a year is the Navy and the Air Force. The Army is anywhere from, it looks like 10 months to maybe 13 months on average. And then a lot of them get deployed for about 13 months. And then there is a chunk that get deployed for like 2 years, right? So you see a lot of variation even between different branches in the military of how long they're deployed, but a lot of them do get deployed for like a year on average, it looks like, but there's variation. So you can explore all of this data yourself this week as well. So let's look at ramifications of deployment on military families, right? So if we know that they're gone for like a year, what do the family that, you know, gets separated from them, how do they respond to it? There's been a fairly recent study actually on this, like one of the first of their kind, which I can't believe it took that long to actually look at this, but they did find that once the military member was deployed, the mental health of that family declined, right? People got upset. But in most cases, that negative effect, you know, it disappeared once that family member came back, right? So those negative effects didn't hold, they didn't linger, they pretty much returned back to normal once that family member came back home, unless that family member experienced a trauma while they were deployed. So if they got PTSD, if they were in a combat zone and they experienced something that traumatized them, when they came back to the family, those negative effects persisted. You would see increases in aggression, in a failure in communication, right? So those negative effects can linger, but it's not because of deployment itself, it's because of that, you know, combat trauma. So negative effects include aggression, marital stress, difficulties in relationships between parents and children. That was one that they talk about a lot. Teenagers perceive these negative effects differently than younger children, but they don't seem to linger unless the parent has trauma. Yeah. Okay. That are not designed to support families. You're going to have that long-term separation between the military member and their family, right? So what we're going to see are two positives, which are cheaper facilities abroad, right? These bases aren't expensive because they're tiny. And you're going to have less of an imposition on that host country, right? You're not going to have massive protests about how much territory they're taking up or the, you know, environmental outcomes or maybe even those judicial issues if that base is a lot tinier and, you know, a lot less intrusive. But you're going to have that long-term separation of families, and instead you're going to have the active duty military personnel stationed on these lily pads and their families stationed probably on a military base, you know, in the US that's designed to just hold, you know, the families. So you're going to maybe, you know, we don't know exactly how much that long-term separation is going to affect the families, because as we saw in that earlier graph, we can hope that it follows the deployment patterns, but we don't know. And even if it does, you're going to see a lot of negative effects while that separation is occurring. Okay. All right, cool. I'm making good time. So we talked about the families. Now let's actually talk about those families that are stationed at home, right? So we've been talking about all the abroad stuff and how we want to, you know, understand the United States military's like global positioning and how that strategy works and how other countries view us. But that's not where everyone in the military lives, right? Most military personnel are stationed in the US. They're working in the US, doing their job here. So military bases, it still doesn't have all of them. It doesn't, because like even the like 4 that I know, you know, to check aren't there. There's none in Texas, and I know there's just the coasts have them. You have them across the middle. They're pretty much everywhere in the country, right? And even we have a National Guard base pretty much in Cedar Rapids, right? So there's a lot of, I think it's a reserve base, but a base. Pretty comprehensive military presence across the country. Yeah, no, Amanda's saying she doesn't see the base that she's looking for. Yeah, this is not all of them, but it's the one that had the most, but it still doesn't have them all. I'm not really sure why certain ones are missing and certain ones aren't. But I wanted to at least show you that they're pretty much everywhere and they have certain trends. So what identifies military families, right? If your family was in the military and you followed your military, parent around, you were called a military brat. I'm not really sure why we call ourselves that, but we do. Reserve and National Guard. So this is people, groups that even, would not be participating in that kind of international idea of the military, still only about 1%. And the military is pretty much at the lowest size it's been for a while, and the highest peak we had was during the Vietnam War. So let's look at some more interesting graphs. I think it's fun. So this is where people who join the military come from, which state they lived in, right? So you see a big concentration in our high population states, New York, Florida, Texas, California, but you also see a lot of them coming from the Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, a little bit from like North Carolina, and then those like more central states and the East Coast don't really got a lot of those military members. Washington, D.C. had the fewest recruits at only 99, which is crazy, but then 16,000 that year came from Texas. So there's a lot of variation in where in the country these individuals are coming from. So there's also a lot of variation in like the demographics of that group and if they're representative of the country as a whole. Okay? So if we look at it, the previous graph was showing where they came from, and then these graphs show where they live once they join the military. Paige is asking, what determines where you get stationed? Your job, essentially, where they need you, what branch of the military you're in as well. So like, if you're in the Air Force, you're going to get stationed at an Air Force base. You probably won't get stationed at an Army base, right? There's variations in which branch of the military you're in and what they need you to do. So what we see on this is that most of the military there's a lot of military personnel in these like southern states, but if you make it proportional to the population of that state itself, right, recognizing that these kind of central states are, less populated than the coastal states, what you actually see is that a lot of proportionally more military personnel are coming from these central states and these southern states. So I just wanted to clarify that there's a bit of a misconception on these numbers because you're not looking at it proportionally, right? If you look at it proportionally, this is actually where, this picture on the right is actually where more of the military members are coming from. 4-1 in the Air Force, 5-1 in the Navy, 15-1 in the Marines. There are not a lot of women in the Marines. Part of this can be that there has been a historical kind of restriction on women being allowed in combat. That's being loosened, very recently, like currently. But that might be a bit of why we see that skew. If we look at race and ethnicity and kind of the distribution of that, this is from 2010, so it's a bit older data. But what this seems to suggest is that there's a pretty similar distribution of race and ethnicity nowadays. So 10 years after this, what you would actually see is that the military is actually more diverse than the country as a whole is. You see a lot more representation on this next slide. No, I do it. Okay. I didn't want to say that. They're generally lower income than the general population of the US as well. So you see a lot more, there are different interests for members of the military than the population as a whole because they have a very kind of skewed demographic distribution, economic distribution, and what they want to achieve in their lives. But again, you can explore this more on your own. So then the last thing I want to point out is that, for the international side, it's important for us to understand this kind of, sociological info because that does have a ramification for the U.S. national security. It's important for the U.S. to be able to upkeep these relationships with their allies, and that kind of unrest can create an actual security threat for the forces we have stationed abroad, right? But how does domestic military bases have an influence on our national security, right? Like, why does it matter that we have these bases within our country? Because there's no one that's going to attack them here, right? There's not some big security thing that they're trying to provide. And what I would say is they are national security, they are relevant to our national security because they actually have a lot of their own different issues, but they do have threats that they're responding to. So the article that I sent to you really likes to talk about the cybersecurity component of it, the privacy component, but what it is at the end of the day is a discussion of a mass shooting that happened on a military base. And what we see is that there have been 5 mass shootings on military bases in 10 years, which, for the standard US percentage maybe is low, but again, consider that that's 1% of the US population getting these kinds of statistics, right? 2 of them were in Fort Hood too. I didn't realize that Fort Hood had 2. So you have to deal with these kinds of issues, right? How does gun control or the issue of gun control or mass shootings work when you're looking at a military base? Because some of these were attributed to foreign influences, to, that ISIS ideology, but some of them were attributed to PTSD, to mental health, right? To that stress created by deployment and the trauma from deployment. So those are all issues that you have to address when you're looking at domestic military presences, because that can actually create a substantial security issue when you're just looking at our military bases. You also have to consider more direct foreign influences and the fact that we train some foreign militaries in our bases. So the shooting that we talked about in our article was in Pensacola, Florida, and it involved cadets that had been sent from Saudi Arabia to get trained in that military base and then go back to Saudi Arabia. So they had, it doesn't really go into a lot of detail, but whatever their issues were, our borders to train in the military, right? Because that's pretty, that's us supporting our allies and creating, a kind of stronger relationship. But are we opening ourselves up to more security risks when we're doing that? Amna says, are these all of the shootings within this past decade? If they are, what do you think has made them more common in recent years? I couldn't say. I don't think there's a lot of consistency in what motivated these different ones. A couple of them were, ideologically motivated. A couple were attributed to mental health issues. So I really don't know. But I do think that it's something we need to be looking at. And it's a thing that makes us recognize that these are also security issues we need to be considering. David asked, lack of mental health resources. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty widely accepted that the PTSD and the long-term mental health issues that come from being in combat aren't being adequately treated, even in our VA or more, currently in our active duty members. So it's something that we know is an issue, but it's more of like a lack of resources at this point that, how do you identify everyone who has had that trauma and how do you help everyone who has had that trauma? Because we've deployed a lot of people, right? But yeah. Do you guys have any other questions about this stuff? Because this is just the conclusion, really. I'm just reiterating the major questions we addressed. So do you guys have any other questions about this? I know it's something that on the surface might not seem like a directly national security issue, but once you look at the ramifications of the decisions that are made on this topic, you can see that it is something that you need to consider when you're looking at, general national security and how effectively the United States can conduct itself militarily at home and abroad. Brooke is asking when the final exam will be. It's on the syllabus. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but I have put it on the syllabus. And it'll be same setup as this last quiz we took, so I'll just leave it open for 24 hours. You'll have 3 hours to take it instead of 120. So you'll have more time to take it, but it's not going to be like bigger than the last quiz you just took. It'll just be on Icon again. All right, I'm gonna end the stream, but I'll leave the chat open. So if you have something you want to say in the chat, you can. But I'm gonna sign off here. Thank you guys so much. You've been great. I'm glad that it seemed like the quiz went really smoothly. Let me know if you have any questions. I technically have office hours. Just email me and I'll open up my Zoom and we can chat if you want. But I will see you guys next week.